Welcome to a conversation on international affairs. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is the distinguished Canadian diplomat and public servant, Allan Gotlieb. Ambassador Gotlieb's career in Canadian public service spans 30 years. He has served during those years as head of the legal division of the External Affairs Department, Under-Secretary of State for External Affairs, and most recently as Ambassador of Canada to the United States from 1981 to 1988. A legal scholar, Ambassador Gotlieb is the author of 4 books. He received his BA degree from Berkeley, his MA from Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and his LLB degree from Harvard. During the month of January, he is a Regents Professor visiting the Berkeley campus. Joining us in the studio is Professor Thomas Barnes, Professor of History and Law, who is also co-chair of the Canadian Studies Program. Ambassador Gotlieb, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
Take us back in time. The year is 47. Why does a 19-year-old Canadian from Canada named Allan Gotlieb come to Cal to study?
Well, I think I was just a typical, one could say, North American. I was restless. I was going to school in Winnipeg University. It was after the war. The college was very crowded, and I had a friend. And the friend moved to California as Winnipeggers up in the frozen north. Winnipeg is the coldest coldest major city in the world. If you want to challenge that, I'll defend it. And colder than Moscow or Leningrad. His family moved to California, and he went to Berkeley, and he said, gee, this is a great place. Hey, come on down, and we can room together. He was my best friend. So I came down, but he'd left by that time. He rolled on. So there I was, in a place that I didn't know a single soul, and to this day I don't know why I came. It was just the sun, I guess, and the spirit of adventure.
And did you know that you were going to major in history when you came?
Not really. Not really. Somebody put a calendar in my hand, which even in those years was very thick, and somebody said, walk in that direction, and gave me the name of a professor who was my advisor. And he was a very nice man, and he said, what do you want to do here? And I said, I'm not sure. What are you interested in? And I said, well, I'm interested in political science, I'm interested in history, I'm interested in anthropology. And he said, well, we have a very good history department. And I opened up the book, and he had a professor teaching Islamic history, and a professor teaching Byzantine history. And I said, my God, this is right out of the Arabian Nights. This is what I'm looking for. So I took those courses.
And you focused on those histories, and you were really drawn into the intellectual excitement of Berkeley at that time in historical studies. When one looks back in one's life, one notices the operation of chance, or very hard for me, as I've indicated, to explain why I came here. And the next 2 years for me were probably the most fascinating of my life intellectually, and I remember them as quite as unique and really quite astonishing. There was a professor who was teaching Byzantine history, and what I knew about Byzantine history was absolute and total. And there were no holes in my lack of knowledge. But Byzantium was always, it fascinated me because it was so foreign, I remember reading a book and said the Byzantine Empire was unique. It took 1,300 years for it to fall.
Yes.
So I went to Professor Ernst Kantorowicz's classes, and I walked into Europe. I walked into the destination point of one of the great intellectual migrations of all time. Berkeley was the recipient of Hitler's mad policies, and more of the great and distinguished scholars of Germany, most of them Jewish but refugees, who were expelled or who managed to get out, came to Berkeley. And Kantorowicz was a key member of that circle. And so for the next 2 years, he had about 20 graduate students. I plunged deeper and deeper into iconography and all of the elements of his approach was completely interdisciplinary, and painting, music, religion, every aspect of life was part of his attempt to recreate and to understand these societies. And stretching back really to the time of the fall of Rome, to early medieval times, was the area or era that I specialized in. And almost everybody I knew in that little group became distinguished professors or pursued very unusual paths in their lives.
What did you take from this experience that impacted on your later career in public service? Or was this just a journey through the life of the mind?
Well, you know, it was. Looking back on it, I think I would give it the highest accolade, namely that it was a journey through the life of the mind. But it did leave me with an impression of the United States, with an impression of a country that has the extraordinary capacity to exploit and to utilize and bring together the best brains. And what I saw in Berkeley was in the history department, but this was happening in the science department and other departments. And you were at the point of beginning to capture most of the Nobel Prizes of the world. And what I saw there was this kind of emancipated environment, open, totally without prejudice, without hierarchy, without status, a frontier which required only one passport, and that was brains. And indeed, this group was a very happy group of people. I doubt if they came out of structured societies, but the sense, the enjoyment of freedom is what I recall also so much. And those qualities of America are assuredly its greatest.
Did you remark at one time the irony, and perhaps a tragic one, that Kantorowicz resigned his professorship here a few years after you were here for refusal to take the Levering Act oath, so-called loyalty oath? Another side of America, perhaps not unique to America, but without drawing you into what was in one sense an internal American matter. Yeah. How did that strike you? Was that part of it?
That's a very fair comment, but it wasn't part of it when I was here, because this great controversy, the California oath controversy, which was a reaction from the Red Scare in Washington, it came later. That's and right. Needless to say, I was astonished that it happened. I was also astonished that one of the leaders of the movement to refuse to sign the oath was Kantorowicz, because he certainly, his past career would not have suggested that he was in the front edge of the fight. He was not a libertarian, but indeed the fact that he was willing, after this long sojourn of persecution and running away from the Nazis, trying to get work in England where he, I think, did not succeed, in the East where he did not succeed, and finding California so hospitable, with a community like Panofsky and Olsky and many others who lived in the hills there, and he settled and acquired a lovely small house in the hills. To be willing to give all that up and to move out again in order to fight a principle which he disapproved of was, I think, represented for me another element of my education, even though it was after I left, and that is a rather heroic attitude towards the basic principles. Needless to say, I was personally very disappointed that the university decided to go that route, and I think that it did have this effect that that group that I worked with and lived with did disperse. Kantorowicz went with Oppenheimer to Princeton, and many of the others left with them or left independently. That is an example, I think, of the tremendous unpredictability and political surges that can take place in your country. But it doesn't derogate, in my mind, from my general principle that these people acted out of principle, but the university did not persecute them and would not have persecuted them. And the university made itself a home to these scholars and continued to do so after they left, and I think has since that time evolved even further, very, very far. One can well discuss what are the limits of freedom, but extraordinarily far in accepting accepting alternative or different or challenging or rejectionist views of society, and I think has almost, it's become its hallmark, the hallmark of this institution.
Coming back 30 years later, what is most striking for Allan Gotlieb as he looks at the campus today in comparison to those years back in the 40s?
Besides the ugliness of Dwinell, which we all comment on.
Well, what I recall, I guess, is there were two Berkeleys when I was here. There was the Berkeley, which was the undergraduate school of beautiful California, and I remember everywhere I went, a kind of homogeneous group of healthy and young people, very homogeneous, almost like out of a Andy Hardy movie of the 30s. I mean, everybody kind of looked the same. I looked like the foreigner, and which I was. But and raw, and sort of, very much like your classic case of a typical, essentially small town American campus. Superimposed on this was this extraordinary these graduate schools which had grown up, in which within in physics and science and history, and which within a decade brought Berkeley up to the very forefront, to the top rung of universities in this country and the world. And what I see now is that this university, that sense of homogeneity that existed, is completely gone. I mean, this is a multiracial society. I mean, you can't step out the door without realizing this is no longer a Protestant white enclave, which it was then. It is an enormously, it's like a huge, when you walk down the streets, you are like in a huge city somewhere where a city consisting of dozens and dozens of crossroads, and everybody seems to be crossing down those roads. It's as if you were pulling people out of every nook and cranny of the world. The diversity is astonishing. The diversity of backgrounds, the diversity of race, the diversity of lifestyles, the diversity of opinions, the diversity of your gastronomy. I didn't realize when I came here that Berkeley was now the absolute center of the world for the counterculture. Counter meaning the food you get at the counters.
Absolutely.
That's right, a real breakthrough. Well, we can't cover your whole distinguished career in this interview, but I guess we want to focus on your years in Washington, and you are associated with the successful implementation of what you call the new rules of diplomacy in Washington. Tell us about those rules and your work in Washington.
Well, the new rules of diplomacy, I have to say in the first instance, may be a kind of exaggerated way of expressing what I was trying to do, but I have to blame myself for that or take credit because that's the terms I used. because really its most quintessential forms are practiced in Washington. And the reason for that is that power is so dispersed and fragmented in Washington. The classic diplomacy, which continues, and which indeed had a tremendous new lease on life because of the enormous increase in the number of sovereign states. If you look at the international community, what we saw in the 20th century was an explosion of 19th century concepts. We saw decolonization, which was a 19th century concept, gave way, fortunately, to another 19th century concept, which was the nation state, or the state, and sovereignty. Sovereign state. And we saw this enormous proliferation. And this, indeed, was the impulse for the United Nations to codify the law of diplomatic relations, which had never been done before. And in an enormously learned exercise that took place over at least, I'd say, 10 years, the international jurists of the world, under the umbrella of the United Nations International Law Commission, codified the law of diplomatic relations, and it was came to be known as, it came to be embodied in the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, which most of our countries are now party to, have ratified. And it is a contemporary, at least it was in the mid-1950s, a completely contemporary codification of international law, including some progressive development. And one of its key articles is that all official business has to be transacted through the intermediary of the foreign ministry. If a foreign ambassador has business to conduct, he does it with the executive branch and with a designated center or channel in the executive branch of the government, the court, the chancellery, the Prime Minister's office, the President's office, whatever it is, but that designated channel is usually the foreign ministry. And now, if that's classic diplomacy, and it is essentially current diplomacy, then my view is that you couldn't possibly practice that in Washington, and if you did, you ought to be expelled for incompetence. Certainly, the State Department is the proper and appropriate channel. And if you want to deliver a diplomatic protest, you go to the State Department. If you want to propose any major undertaking in the foreign policy field, the proper channel is the State Department. But if you look at the substance of international relations, and if you try to quantify it, the vast number of issues which have become the substance of international relations are generated by forces which are represented by other departments of government or by the legislative branch. And the result of all that is that in terms of Canada-US relations, most of the conflicts that I had to deal with were generated out of initiatives taken in the United States Congress or taken in regulatory bodies outside of the stretch and purview of the State Department. And whereas the State Department could be helpful, they couldn't possibly lobby effectively on the Hill for every country that had a problem. No. You had to do that yourself. You had to explain it. You had to fight your own fights. You had to work not only with the State Department, but with the Commerce Department, the Trade Department. Sometimes you had to work a little bit against some of these domestic departments too, but that's also always a very tricky business. But by the new diplomacy, I mean a number of activities which take one fairly close in the domain of domestic affairs and the domestic processes of government, the internal process, should I say, of government.
So you're talking about issues like trade, you're talking about issues like acid rain, trucking regulation, what we traditionally thought of as the core domestic issues in a way.
That's correct. That is absolutely correct. Issues that are not, that may well be called domestic issues in the United States. For a very good example, I think the clearest is the problem of acid rain. Canada, the simplest way to understand this issue is that over half of the acid rain that falls in Canada originates in the United States. The general scientific opinion to which we subscribe, and I think most Americans would subscribe who follow this, is that you cannot absorb more than 18 pounds per year per acre of acid rain without serious and possibly irreversible harm. If we were to close down Canadian industry altogether, just pull down the smokestacks, go back to a pastoral society, we'd still get more than 18 pounds. It would be coming from the United States. So that means that to solve what most Canadians would identify as the most critical environmental issue that we know, and one of the top concerns that most Canadians identify on their score sheet of public issues, United States behavior and activity is fundamentally important. Now, United States air quality issues of pollution are dealt with by United States domestic laws. They're not part of any treaty. They're not part of any international agreement that reflects these international obligations. It is a domestic law that governs air. It's called the Clean Air Act of 1970. And that means that if there is to be any new controls on acid rain, they would have to be embodied in an amendment to the Clean Air Act or in regulations under it. How far could you go under the existing act? What is the scope for interpretation? Or what amendments do you have to have? So that the whole subject of Canadian concern about acid rain immediately leads one into the issue of the amendment of a U.S. domestic law.
So that your predecessors on an issue like this would have possibly filed a protest with the Secretary of State. But the ambassadors now really work the halls of Congress. And who do you have to talk to convince, to argue with? Is it only the Speaker or the Secretary of Energy in the executive, or are there others now?
Well, if you take the subject of acid rain, and if you are trying to advocate the position that the United States should enter into a negotiation with Canada for a treaty to reduce the transboundary flow, you would identify the key players. In the Senate, you would identify the chairman of the Environmental Committee and the senior Republican member or minority member. When I was there, it was for a time Senator Stafford. Senator Mitchell is now the leader in the Senate. You would be very conscious of their role, but you would also be very conscious of people who weren't on the committee who could also be important. For example, the Environmental Committee was usually favorable to action. So they would pass or be prepared to pass a bill that would do something, but it would never go anywhere. So you would have to be aware of who were some of the leaders or important senators who would oppose that, and you'd want to explain to them what your problems are, why this is a problem in the United States, and what Canada is hoping to achieve. You'd want to explain what Canada is doing, because a lot of the opposition said, well, Canada's not doing anything. Canada just wants a free ride. Obviously, if you're opposed to action, you're going to fight back. The same on the House side. You have committees, they were headed by Congressman Waxman from California, Sikorsky in Minnesota, and there were, you have the chairman of one of the most powerful committees, Chairman Dingell, who was very skeptical, if not opposed.
Detroit.
Yeah, Detroit. So you would constantly be in discussion with such individuals and their staffs. You would be discussing with environmental organizations here or meeting with them because they would want information about Canada. They want the latest data on the destruction of Canadian lakes. They want to work with us. In the administration, not only is the Congress very decentralized, but the administration was very decentralized, certainly in the Reagan years, and maybe forever now, I don't know. So that in the administration, you'd have the State Department, you would have the Energy Department, you'd have the Interior Department, you'd have the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, very, very powerful players. You would even try to involve the Defense Department. Why would you want to involve the Defense Department? Because you would want to make the argument, if you were me, which I did, look, if you want a successful summit coming up, if you then you've got to try to make this summit a success, a meeting, let's say, between the two leaders. And if acid rain is going to produce a blow-up, it's not going to be conducive to movement on other items. It's just these aren't formally linked, but
there are linkages.
There are linkages. The linkages of the relationship as a whole. So, and then you would find here also now the White House, two sides: the domestic side of the White House and the National Security Council. Very often, issues that Canada dealt with, or concerned Canada, were dealt with on the domestic side. Very often, they were dealt with on both sides, and again, having identified these key administration groups, very often you'd have to identify the players, because a lot of power, in the executive branch, in my experience, there was a lot of independent activity, a lot of freewheeling. In French, they say franc tireur, franc tireur.
Loose cannon.
Loose cannons, yeah. Not mercenaries,
Free shooters.
Free shooters. And
sounds very Byzantine. That's right.
Anaerobic
Go back.
health.
That's right. That's right.
You've got it. You've explained the major threat of that.
That's right. That's why we do these edits. Now, but also in.
Could I ask just one question here that follows through on that? You might say that the new diplomacy, in one sense, began, for instance, in the old days of the Kuomintang and the China lobby, as it were. Israel's a very powerful force in the halls of Congress. There are friends of Israel in Congress. When you mentioned Senator Mitchell, who I suppose is probably right from a Canadian point of view on acid rain. Maine is another recipient and very concerned about acid rain for obvious reasons, the same as Canada's. Yet, Senator Mitchell, I suppose one can say predictably, voted against the free trade agreement. Of course, so did Senator Cohen of Maine, the Republican senator from Maine, and one understands, again, Maine's kinds of concerns. But in a way, it almost as if the position that Senator Mitchell took is a special interest, or an immediate interest, or at least not a non-Canadian oriented or non-friendly, user-friendly towards Canada position. Without necessarily talking about Senator Mitchell, is there really any? Can Canada count on over across the board any large segment of well-disposed congressional opinion?
Or are there no permanent alliances? Or
yes. Are there? In other words, is there enough linkage in one sense to make a?
There are no permanent alliances, and that was one of my 10 principles of the new diplomacy. You can't. Other foreign powers can, in some areas, you mentioned the China lobby, or you can take Israel, or the Greeks, or the Turks, or the Pakistanis. You may develop a particular constituency. May not be very powerful, may be very powerful, but usually it is maybe possible for a foreign country to have certain congressmen that are sensitive to that ethnic vote, and the ambassador or the embassy does not have to become involved directly. in the U.S. process. It's done through U.S. special interest, or the American way of life. In the case of Canada, of course, we have an enormous number of Canadians in the United States. If Canadians were organized, if they had a similar view, we'd have a lobby which could move the United States right off the map. That's awesome.
Many of them educated in America.
I once made the point that after traveling across the United States and seeing a number of Canadians and counting them in California, 1 million, Florida, 2 million, Texas, 500,000, that I concluded that Canada was a country of 26 million, 26 million Canadians, 52 million of whom were living in the United States. And but Canadians absolutely do not identify with Canada on issues in a political context in the United States. Whatever they may think about acid rain or trade, we've never in all my time ever used or ever thought of using or dreamed of using Canadian power in the sense of Canada being an ethnic community. It isn't. Canadians are simply not into that. And there are no ethnic parades, and there's no ethnic festivals, and there's no ethnic vote. And so a Senator Moynihan, for example, who is a great friend of Canada on acid rain and a great friend of Canada on free trade, really took the lead in seeking retaliation against Canada for certain cultural policies on broadcasting, which were injuring, as he believed and as they believed, a TV station in Buffalo. And that makes the Canadian diplomacy all the more difficult. There's no handful or of key sort of people on the Hill that are responsive to a Canadian point of view. Now, having said that, I would want to qualify it, and I think that's a good thing, by the way. I think that's democratic, I think that's fair, and I think that's one of the reasons why Canada, I like to think, is decently regarded in this country, because for better or for worse, the issues are decided, the conflicts are decided in terms of genuine interests, and not because of some attempt to manipulate public opinion. It's legitimate, it's fair, but we don't do it. And actually, the reason we don't do it is we couldn't do it, but we don't do it. But if I could just finish this point, there are a handful of people in my experience of 7-8 years who were, I thought, particularly conscious of the importance of Canada to the United States in the full sense of the term relationship, appreciative of it in its economic consequences, in its military and geopolitical consequences, historic dimension. And I think that whereas they could and did oppose Canada vigorously on certain issues, nevertheless, I could describe them in a way as being more than routinely sensitive to the importance of the Canada-U.S. relationship. People who took leadership stances. I would identify Senator Moynihan in that category in New York. I would identify former Senator Evans of Washington, who stepped down the other day voluntarily, but I would identify him. I would include Senator John Chafee of Rhode Island. I would include Senator Bill Bradley of New Jersey. And I don't want to be exclusive, but these are some of the leading names that come to mind of people that would worry when things were going badly, would be disturbed if there were deterioration in the relationship, that had a sense of the broader importance. One of my bon mots, if I can use it to say that, in terms of the new diplomacy, is I said that in the United States, foreign countries are special interests, and not very special ones at that. Well, the people I've mentioned didn't see Canada simply as a special interest.
In this work which you're describing, which strikes me as being the work of political education, really, so maybe you still are an educator in one sense of the word. In your speeches that I've looked at in other comments you've made on the campus during your stay here, you talk about the importance of the social life of Washington, really, in these efforts. Talk a little about that.
Well, in my attempt to describe a new diplomacy, I describe a physical context. And the physical context I've likened to sort of being inside an atom or something, where you have all kinds of particles floating around, maybe 1,000 particles, and each particle is charged with some power. Each has a charge. And that charge is one that can cause you pain, your country pain. It might be through putting a tariff on a potato, to denying you access to a military procurement contract, to as broad as the country is and the interests are. That's how broad that's how broad the powers might be inside of all these particles. So these particles, some of them are charged with more power than others. The president, I would say, has probably got the biggest charge. But the chairman of the Finance Committee of the Senate's got a huge charge, depending on the issues. Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee has a huge charge. And because power is so dispersed, it means that issue by issue, you have to align, the particles have to be aligned in such a way that they are favorable to you, or that are not aligned in such a way that they're negative to you. Well, if that is the nature of influence and decision-making, if there's hundreds of units out there doing it, then you've got to reach out very broadly. You've got to make contact with an awful lot of them. The wisest comment ever made to me by a diplomat, I wouldn't want to say the only wise one, but certainly the wisest I recall, is when I first came there, the departing British ambassador, Nico Henderson, a very intelligent man, he said, I called on him and he said, you know, he said, my dear Gotlieb, he said, anybody in Washington tells you that he knows where a decision was made is either a fool or a liar. Yeah. So decision-making is enormously complex. You never know really who the key players are. They shift on anyway from decision to decision. I've said you can't have a strategy for dealing with Washington. You have to have micro-strategies, as many micro-strategies as there are issues. So you've got to reach out. And how do you reach out? How do you get to know these people? You can't try to present your point of view if you don't even know them. Not all of them are going to rush to answer your telephone if they don't know who you are. If they do, you might get a fairly brisk call, reply, or you might wait several weeks to see them. And so the social life in Washington, and I'm speaking about my experience, but really this is generally true, social life in Washington is very useful because it provides a kind of common field in which people can meet, get to know each other, and actually do business. Parties are a continuation of business by other means. The amount of transactions or contacts that are made at night or informally are astonishing. You can walk into a reception. The most popular receptions in Washington, the ones which really draw are those given by the media. That's because the media is so powerful. But you can walk into a media reception of some TV program that is congratulating itself on its birthday, and you may find 20 or 30 senators. You'll find half the cabinet. You know, you may be having one devil of a problem, and you may just see the person. It might be the national security advisor who's been in a crisis for 4 days, and you can't even get to see him. In any case, national security advisors many of them don't normally deal with foreign diplomats. Some of them, sometimes they
and technically shouldn't. You know? Technically
shouldn't, that's right. So you may, or you may be dealing with a number 2 national security advisor with whom you're not getting anywhere. And you can't very well go to the number 1 because the number 2 would resent it very much, and you have to take the long view if you're there. And in any case, it's very unlikely the number 1 would want to overrule the number 2. But if you meet him at a party and you start talking and you're having a drink or you're sitting beside him at dinner, then fair is fair. I mean, then you've got a chance to say, oh, by the way, you know, and so Jane Austen said, my wife, who's a writer, is fond of quoting her. She said, Jane Austen, it's Pride and Prejudice, Jane, whatever her name was, Elizabeth, said, everything happens at parties. Exactly. A lot of information is, in my new diplomacy descriptions, I have said, and I think being quoted often as saying, in Washington, gossip is not gossip. gossip is intelligence.
Now, the culminating achievement of your days in Washington is the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Treaty. And I believe that it was a working out, the obtaining of that treaty, the reaching of that agreement was the working out of these rules. But I think you've also said that the treaty itself is an effort to institutionalize the relationship in a way to transcend these new rules of diplomacy. Could you explain that? I think it's a very interesting point.
Well, I think the agreement recognizes at the foundations of the argument for the agreement is the fact that in our two democracies, where power is decentralized, and in Canada it's also decentralized in different ways, in the provinces and that indeed if you try to deal with everything on a purely multilateral basis, and if you try to deal with them channeling everything for a decision at the executive levels, that the whole process becomes very politicized, and it really, I guess you could say that, to borrow a phrase from George Bush, the relationship doesn't consist of 1,000 points of light, but 1,000 points of contacts. And one of the things that the agreement does, and enters into a new ground, is it tries to create institutions which are cognizant, or which the rationale for which is founded on this phenomenon of the fragmented character of decision making and the nature and origins of conflict. It creates institutions which need to be utilized and which can be utilized, which recognize this the various nature of the forces at work. I describe that by saying that a lot of the conflict is let's say a classic conflict is a special interest group moving a regulatory body to pass or to take some kind of a trade action. Well, that very, very, very often almost escapes the executive power. And if it is very hard for executive power to be wielded, that was what the Omnibus Trade Bill was all about, trying to limit executive power. So the agreement says that in that kind of context, we'll create an international body, a new institution, which will address those issues and which will resolve that conflict. Now that is very, very innovative and very, very unusual. So what I'm saying is that instead this free trade agreement in a giant way, I say giant, I guess that's not the right word. It's in a breakthrough manner, because it is a breakthrough, moves the relationship from government to government to institution to institution. It institutionalizes the relationships of Canada and the United States in important sectors of the economic field. Now that is very unusual for both of our countries. And thus I think the move from institution to institution institutionalization is a recognition of the enormous complexities of government decision making, and requires certain channels to be moved. Before, the way a conflict could arise, I say, it could go from from a special interest to a regulatory body. The regulatory body doesn't handle it properly, it goes to the executive. The executive doesn't handle it properly, it goes to the Congress. The Congress tries to pass a law, all of it part of a politicized process. Now, that kind of quarrel could be referred automatically to a consultative commission. If it takes a quasi-judicial dispute, it goes to a binational panel. Neither country can even pass a law that derogates from the agreement. Can't even pass a law without notifying the other country first, without agreeing to consultation. And if the law doesn't meet even with the spirit of the agreement, that law can be tested by a new body, a new institution. That is the binational panels for compatibility with the agreement. So it introduces a sort of arm's length institution to try to channel some of all these threads, these various undisciplined or unpredictable points of conflict into a more rational and neutral process of. Now, it doesn't go miles down that direction, but it goes some yards. It begins.
But what has happened to our respective sovereignties? Here we have entered the 20th century with an old 19th century concept. We've codified it in the International Law Commission of the UN, and suddenly we're giving up control. I'm playing the devil's advocate, I suppose.
But well, this
is both sides of that 49 North boundary.
Well, I think the key point that is not understood in democracies, I don't think it's understood in Canada. I say, be arrogant, I don't think it's understood in the United States. I don't think it's understood in Britain. On the part of the population as a whole, is that we live in an era of greatly mitigated sovereignty. Sovereignty in the 19th century concept as a concept, it doesn't exist anymore. We are all, because of interdependence and the global economy, we have all entered into vast networks of treaty obligations that don't allow us to do. Even a tariff agreement is a mitigation on our sovereignty. If we decide that we cannot prevent an American, let's say, word processor coming into Canada, if we can't say no, keep your word processor out, or yes, let it come in, but we're going to charge you 1,000% tariff. We can't do that. We can't do it under the GATT. That mitigates our sovereignty. What's happened to our sovereignty? It cannot be done. You say, oh, well, we did it, we didn't have to do it. Well, whatever the method, we no longer can do what in pure sovereignty you can do. So sovereignty is a vastly mitigated concept. The problem, I think, is similar in all the democracies, is that whereas sovereignty doesn't exist as we knew it, it's a myth. The margin for independent action is so slight. Whether you're dealing with your interest rates or you're dealing with your almost any sector of society, you cannot act without potentially violating treaty obligations, potentially causing effects which could hurt others and then hurt you in return. Although that is true, and although the practitioners of international relations know it, it is not sufficiently understood, in my opinion, by many, or accepted by many practitioners of domestic policy. They tend to regard these arguments as wimpish and excuses for non-action because they operate in the domestic field. But more particularly, it's not, I think the political discourse about sovereignty in all of the democracies is in 19th century terms. No politicians talk in these terms when it comes to national interest. They talk, and this, incidentally, this is one of the reasons for the enormous popularity of decisive action on the part of governments. When Mrs. Thatcher went into the Falklands, when President Reagan delivered in Grenada, Libya, enormously popular. This is sovereignty. We did it. But the very examples I give you show how rare it is and how exceptional. But what I'm trying to say is that public opinion still thinks about sovereignty in 19th century terms. And the politicians are fearful of rebutting that or trying to get up and say, sovereignty, that's a lot of, let's not talk baloney, let's talk real. Politicians don't talk that way. Now in Canada, the free trade debate was about sovereignty. Many of the parties that opposed it and the population said, it impairs our sovereignty. And you said, well, what do you mean? And you said, well, we will slowly lose control over our destiny. Our culture will become further diluted. We will not be able to maintain our national identity. But it's always in terms of the loss of sovereign power. In Canada, we even talk about cultural sovereignty.
Yes.
As I hear you talking about these relations of type dependency and interdependency and the political education work that you were doing in Washington, in a way, it helps me understand something I know that you've been associated with, which is trying to support Canadian studies on the various campus. Is that the key here, that there's a lot of education that needs to be done about other countries, about the new international relations, and so on?
Well, that is absolutely correct. You know, if I had to put my finger on the most important factor in international relations and the most important quality in improving and maintaining good international relations, it's understanding. And misunderstanding is the greatest danger. And I'll tell you that misunderstanding is a particular danger, even greater danger, among nations that are very much alike. Mm-hmm. Because when they get very much alike, then when they differ, there's very little sympathy for it, because people don't understand why would they. I mean, you know, we have now opened up our investment policies. Mm-hmm. They're still more restrictive than yours. Sure. But in earlier years, when we were in the government, when the elected government of the day believed that more restrictive policies were necessary, an American might say, let's say it's 15 years ago, they'd say, well, why would Canada restrict U.S. ownership of energy, of oil and gas reserves? Idaho doesn't restrict them. I mean, why would Canada? Yeah. If the person doesn't realize that that the public policies in Canada are going to be very different, and there's a reason for their difference. If they then when conflict occurs, there can be a very bad fallout. There can be resentment. There can be distrust. Mm-hmm. Family quarrels, if I can create a metaphor, yes, are worse than quarrels among traditional enemies in any way. And Canada and the United States are quite like family, but we are not the same. And there is a great seed for misunderstanding in Canada-U.S. relations. The only way, and by the way, in many ways, I think that those seeds can grow in spite of the free trade agreement. The reason why they can grow, maybe will grow, is that information is being disseminated today to most people in cruder and cruder, more blunt, unsophisticated terms. Sure. I mean, information now belongs, information is now communicated in 9-second capsules on television. Most people in America and Canada get their information from television. You can't deal with the nuances, with the subtleties of that contribute to understanding by watching a television program, even if it's a good one, even if it's on PBS. Yes. And if you want to really create strong foundations for international relations, you have to address the issue of understanding the foreign societies. The only way the most effective way to do that is in the schools. Mm-hmm. And in the universities. That is a long-term investment. Long-term investments regrettably are not as popular as they should be. You don't see immediate returns. You may not see any returns at all in your eyes. But it is education and knowledge are the key components. They're the sine qua non of understanding. You don't necessarily produce it, but they are the sine qua non. You can't have it without knowledge. And therefore, I think education is a fundamental element in promoting good international relations. And Canadian Studies is a pioneer effort on the part of Canada to stimulate that in the United States. Because frankly, we found the level of interest in the United States in doing that very, very low. Mm-hmm. Eminent universities, the Harvards, the Yales, the Princetons, the Californias. Mm-hmm. I mean, you would teach anything here, anything. Mm-hmm. But it would be impossible to learn about a country with you have a border, the longest border in the world of two countries. Mm-hmm. A country that buys about a third of all of your manufactured exports. Mm-hmm. a country that you visit more than any other.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You couldn't learn anything about it.
I can't help interjecting that we have before us an example of such an investment, since the people of California did contribute to your education 30 years ago. But the
We also have another example in the form of Professor Barnes, who I think is, who has done pioneer work in this area and is kind of, I don't want to reflect on others and say he's been a one-man band, but he's been a leader.
Far from it.
He's been a leader. He's been a pioneer in this, and he's created, I think, himself, because of his commitment, I think a community now that are committed to understanding and learning about Canada.
If we can have you with us, we'd have an even larger community if you just stay.
And one final point, which I'll let you respond to briefly. It strikes me that this new world that you described so well is a world of multiple identifications, and that Canadians educated in the United States will be relating back to American universities, and it's a very sort of complex world in which we're going to still keep our national identities, but we're going to apply them in different contexts and really have a cosmopolitan tinge to them.
I think that's true. I think in universities, I mean, it's a terribly overworked phrase, and networking, but I think in fact, even in the field of education and science and discipline, it's been true in the past, but it's going to become even more true that that scholars are going to have to relate to each other and over great distances. And I think I see in Canadian studies that developing very, very much. It's almost as if intellectually there was no boundary.
Yes, that's exactly true.
Yeah.
There's cross-fertilization, both sides.
Well, I regret to say that our time is up. I want to thank you, Ambassador Gotlieb, in your stay here as a Regents professor. I think you've demonstrated you're the master of the game. Professor Nelson Polsby said last night that you were the master of nuance, and I guess the final thing is that you came, you saw, and you understood in your role as ambassador. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for Professor Barnes, and thank you very much
Thanks, Harry,
for joining us for this conversation on international affairs.
For information on this series, contact the Institute of International Studies, 215 Moses Hall, UC Berkeley, Berkeley, California 94720, or call area code 415-642-2474.